Saudi Aramco, confined space, responsibilities. Confined space entry. Review the confined space entry plan that is unique to the specific confined space. Communicate the confined space entry plan, for example. Specific confined space hazards, precautions, responsibilities, emergency procedures, to entrance and standby men. Ensure proper work permits, confined space entry, hot work, etc., are issued. Verify all precautions of the confined space entry plan and applicable work permits are properly implemented. Designate qualified standby men who are fluent in the language needed to communicate with the CSES or rescue team. Verify entrance and standby men are properly trained. Coordinate confined space operations when employees of more than one maintenance crew or contractor will be working simultaneously inside or adjacent to the confined space. Provide sufficient manpower and equipment for safe confined space entry and work inside the space. Verify the confined space is properly isolated per GI 6.012, purged and the atmosphere is safe to enter. Ensure the atmosphere within the confined space is monitored as indicated on the confined space entry permit and the confined space entry plan. Ensure confined space entry and gas test logs are properly completed. Ensure the proper PPE is provided to personnel entering the confined space and to each standby man. Ensure adequate means of communication, for example, two-way radio, fire extinguisher, non-CO2 type, and SCBA are available to each standby man. Verify rescue equipment and a rescue team are available in the event of an emergency requiring evacuation of the confined space. Ensure the confined space entrance is barricaded and blocked and a no entry sign posted if the confined space entry is suspended. Terminate confined space entry and cancel work permits as necessary, for example. Unsafe conditions develop. Confined space standby men shall review the confined space entry plan and applicable work permits to understand the confined space hazards, precautions, responsibilities and emergency procedures. Understand the effects of exposure to potential hazardous substances in the confined space. Maintain a confined space entry log and maintain a continuous count of entrance. Prevent unauthorized personnel from entering the confined space. Monitor activities inside and outside the confined space to determine if it is safe for entrants to enter and remain inside the space. Maintain two-way communication with entrants to monitor entrant status. For example, behavioral effects of hazard exposure, and alert entrants of a need to evacuate the confined space. Have communications equipment readily available on-site and immediately notify proper personnel, for example, CSES, rescue team, in event of an emergency. Remain at the confined space entry point until relieved by another designated standby man, or until all entrants have exited the confined space. Never attempt to enter the confined space, even in an emergency, until relieved. Perform no other duties that could interfere with his primary responsibilities as a confined space standby man. Order entrants to evacuate the confined space under any of the following conditions. An unsafe condition develops inside or outside the confined space. An entrant displays abnormal behavioral effects of hazard exposure. If he must leave the area and no relief confined space standby man is provided. Entrance into a confined space shall review the confined space entry permit and confined space entry plan and verify that all precautions have been properly implemented. Understand the effects of exposure to potential hazardous substances in the confined space. Understand the proper use of PPE that is to be used inside the confined space. Not enter a confined space until they are satisfied that all necessary precautions have been properly taken to ensure their safety and they clearly understand their work assignment within the space. Communicate with the confined space standby man to enable the standby man to monitor the entrance status, for example. Behavioral effects of hazard exposure. Promptly alert the confined space standby man and other entrants, and exit from the confined space as quickly as possible, whenever an order to evacuate is given by the confined space standby man, or the CSES. The entrant recognizes any warning signs, or symptoms of exposure to a hazardous condition, or substance. An emergency alarm is activated.